Welcome. As I said, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am Rabbi Shuli Passo, the Director of Community Engagement at B'nai Jeshurun, and it's a real privilege to welcome Ronald Simpson-Bey and Andy Potter to a conversation tonight that is part of the thinking and envisioning and re-envisioning that we are doing guided by the Jewish calendar, where we are in a Shemitah year, a sabbatical year, which invites us to pause, to reset, to reflect on what's going on in our world and our society, and to interrupt old patterns of thinking, old habits, and see how we can imagine things for the better and imagine things anew. So at BJ, we are using this year and this theme of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, to think expansively and creatively about contemporary concerns, including climate change and environmental stewardship, equity and inequity in our society, be it economic, racial, gender, social, the land of Israel, and our hopes for that region of the Middle East, and more. And for every topic that we explore this year, we really want to be asking ourselves, how can we pause? How can we pause, release ourselves from the patterns of thinking that may be entrenched regarding this particular topic, a given topic, and imagine some new possibilities? And tonight we're beginning a three-part series on the interrelated topics of criminal justice, policing, and security. And there is quite a lot that needs reimagining here. In 2019, there were 2.1 million people in the United States in prisons and jails. That's 737 people per 100,000. We are the global leader in incarceration. This, by comparison, even though our numbers fell a little bit in 2020 because of the pandemic and also efforts to decarcerate, we still have 1.8 million people incarcerated, and that's 639 per 100,000 people. Canada, our neighbor to the north, has 104 people incarcerated per 100,000. France, 101. Germany, 76, England, 137, and Norway, which I hope we'll hear a little bit about tonight, 54. 54. And we are at 639. So there's a lot to rethink. And we're really, really fortunate this evening, privileged to have with us two people, an unlikely pair, some would say, who are really thinking creatively and courageously about how we can fix this broken system, and what a new reality for justice in our society in the United States could look like. I'm not going to go into great length about their bios because I'm going to ask each of you in a moment to share a little bit about your story. But just to note that Ronald Simpson-Bey is an activist and leader in the criminal justice reform movement with Just Leadership USA. And Andy Potter is the founder of One Voice and the director of the Michigan Corrections Organization. And he is familiar to many in our community, given the that BJ did with MCO, the Michigan Corrections Organization, several years ago. So we have someone here tonight who's coming from the law enforcement side of criminal justice, of the system, and someone who is coming from the activist and reforming perspective, also having spent quite a number of years incarcerated. So I am going to, again, thank you for being here tonight. And I really just want to start by asking each of you to share a little bit more about yourself and how you got to the work or the work that you do, and your relationship to the prison system, the criminal justice system. Tell us a little bit about your childhood, some of the choices you made, and how you got to where you are right now. And Ronald, maybe let's start with you.
Okay, Andy's the better looking. I thought you were gonna call him first. Anyway, thank you for inviting me to this courageous conversation with my good friend Andy Potter. I am Ronald Simpson-Bey. I am the Director of Outreach and Alumni Engagement for an organization called JustLeadershipUSA. We are a New York-based national organization, criminal justice reform, committed to cutting the national prison population in half. We seek to do that through our leadership development training program we have for directly impacted people, through our policy work that we do around the country, and through our collaborative advocacy work that we do with other organizations. We currently have just under 1,200 leaders that we have trained since 2015 in 45 states plus Washington, D.C. So we look to make a measurable impact on the criminal justice reform work, because we believe that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, yet furthest away from resources, opportunity, and power. So Just Leadership seeks to put our communities, our directly impacted communities, at the forefront of these conversations around criminal justice reform, because those most impacted by the system should be those leading the conversation to change it. Because I always make the analogy, I say, well, you wouldn't have a conversation around women's reproductive rights without women at the table, would you? And the obvious answer is no. And so by the same token, why would you have a criminal justice reform conversation without people that have been directly impacted by the criminal justice the criminal justice system? So I am proud to be part of this conversation. I come to this conversation as someone who served 27 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections from 1985 to 2012 on a wrongful conviction. Our conviction was overturned in 2012 by the federal courts, and I was subsequently released. And I just continue to do the work that I have been doing for 25 years inside of prison, advocating for the change and the improvement of the conditions for those who were locked in our nation's prisons. And I didn't meet Andy at that time, but our paths were running parallel lanes at that time. And I let him share his piece of the story around, his involvement with the Michigan Department of Corrections. Andy?
Thanks. It's good to see everybody. I always enjoy coming and being around and having these kinds of conversations with BJ. It's great to see everybody. Thanks, Ronald. And Ronald and I met in 2014, Ronald?
17.
Time flies, but I was just kidding with him and said, how is it that time goes by like this? And I just keep getting older and you just keep getting better looking. He always tries to get in there first and put it to me, but
I got good filters on my computer. I got good filters, so you don't see that.
So I would say I came from a very broken town. I'll tell you a little about my history, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. And I'll pass it back to Ronald a little bit to tell his story. But I was one of 4 children. My mother was a single mother. My dad died in Vietnam. We were in a very small town that was pretty well devastated by manufacturing that came in and then left. I grew up, and it was a pretty rough neighborhood. I grew up in and out of jail most of my life, and my friends did as well. And higher education wasn't really an option for my friends and I. Really the options we had were military, manufacturing, like Oldsmobile at the time, but which is gone. And then corrections. This was in the early 80s, and it was tough on crime. And they started to build prisons in a lot of these broken towns. And that was an option for me. So I went to work in corrections in the mid to late 80s. And so I've been in and around corrections for over 30 years, most of my adult life. And I'm the executive director for Michigan Corrections Organization, which is the union that represents all the corrections officers in the state of Michigan. And in 2016, there was a riot over the food. And not just the food, it was a perfect storm, really, because they had raised the prices for the store goods. They had brought in a private vendor, a food vendor that served horrible food, horrible food. And then they lowered the wages for those who were incarcerated that worked throughout the institution. So it was a perfect storm. And the officers that were in my union, those that I led, took pictures of the food with maggots in it and other things like that. And they sent those pictures to me so I could take it to the legislature and try to get something done. It was horrific. And it was a moral issue. And it was the first time that I had really seen corrections officers take a stand on a moral issue and say it's wrong. They shouldn't be doing this. And in the riot, not one officer was physically harmed. Mentally, of course, they took a toll, but physically, no one was harmed. And the reason was because we shared that plate in some ways. And I interviewed all of those officers after that riot, and every one of them told me it was wrong. And they couldn't blame people for how they reacted. And they wanted me to take it on a national level and have this conversation on a national level. So that's what I did. I founded One Voice United with a group of colleagues that I feel that are some of the smartest people that I know, for sure. And so we started out trying to bring those reformers and corrections officers and union leaders together to try to unearth places of alignment, like the food. And there's other places of alignment as well that we may get into a little bit later. But the food was like the best example I could think of, right? And said to myself, if we could align on this just in my state, how come our entire profession can't align with the reform movement? It's changing the landscape, and corrections officers and leaders haven't been in that conversation. And frankly, most of that is because as leaders, we didn't do a good enough job bringing them into the center, like Ronald and his colleagues do. So that's what started One Voice United, and that's what led to Ronald and I meeting each other. And that story is kind of an interesting story, and we'll get into more details around that too. So I'll pass it back to you, Shuli or Ronald.
Thank you, Andy. I want to definitely dig into the issue you brought up around the food and also other issues that you have been working on as part of One Voice. But I want to give Ronald a chance first to share a little bit more about your story and how you grew up and how you got to the Michigan corrections system.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for that story, Andy. I'm originally born in Flint, Michigan. I currently live out in Phoenix, Arizona, but I was born in Flint, Michigan many, many moons ago, 1957. And I was raised in a two-parent home. My father was a school teacher. My mom was a homemaker. And, you know, it was five of us. I had two younger brothers and two younger sisters. And I went to the Flint Beecher school system. I graduated, went to college. I was a high school track star and played football, and ended up going to Eastern Michigan University to run track there as well. And subsequent, I went to work at General Motors about 1976, it's not 77. I went to work at General Motors, got on skilled trades. And around 1980, my father died, and I was about 23 years old at the time. And I started, using drugs. I started selling drugs. I started getting into the street life. And, after my father had died. And it led to an incident in late 1985, where I was involved in an incident in Flint, Michigan, a shooting of a police officer, me and three of my co-defendants. But what happened, I wasn't there at the scene where he actually got shot. I was with them at the beginning of the incident. So I ended up getting implicated in the crime and getting charged, and I got convicted to a 50-year sentence, ended up in the Michigan Department of Corrections in 1985. And so from there, the first 5 years, doing time in prison, you kind of do it in stages. The first 5 years, I was angry because, I was in prison for a crime I hadn't done. And I was just angry at the world because in my life at that time. And so the first 5 years, I was part of the problem, not part of the solution. And one day in 1990, I read a book called Visions for Black Men by a professor named Dr. Naeem Akbar out of Florida State. And it gave me this vision, this epiphany of what I, as a Black man, owe to myself, to my family, and to my community at large, to be an asset and not a liability. So I took that 90-page book and I applied the principles to myself. And I stopped I got out of my anger. I started looking at myself. I started looking around me, and I took the focus off of me. I said, well, what can I do to serve my community, which was prison at the time? So I became an activist in prison. I started fighting to change prison conditions, prison policies. I became a named plaintiff on the largest class action lawsuit in Michigan Department of Corrections. It was called Kane versus MDOC. It went from 1988 to 2005. Me and 5 of my colleagues, we litigated the case ourselves without attorneys, and we had a pretty good outcome. And we felt like we didn't win, but we had a good consent decree. We got some concessions. So during that period of time, on Father's Day 2001, while I had been in prison about 16 years at that time, I was waiting for my 4 children to come visit, my son and 3 daughters. I talked to my son that morning, said, hey, Dad, I'm going to bring the girls up. We're going to visit that day. And, you know, being in prison, a visit from your children is like next best thing to freedom. So I sat there and waited, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. No one showed up. So I got on the phone, made a phone call, trying to figure out where my children were. So out of all people, I called my ex-mother-in-law. I said, hey, Mom, have you seen the kids? They're supposed to come visit today. She said, you haven't heard? I said, no, I haven't. What's going on? She said, little Ronnie been shot and killed. My 21-year-old son had been shot and killed by a 14-year-old juvenile in the streets of Flint, Michigan on Father's Day, 2001, while I was waiting for him to come visit. I can't begin to tell you the pain, anger, and anguish, anxiety I felt about that. But at that time, I had been in prison long enough to know I didn't want the same outcome for this young man that killed my son, because I knew that by sending this young man to life in prison without parole, because that's what they were giving juveniles in Michigan at the time, that I knew that he would not have another chance at life. It wasn't going to bring my son back, and it was only going to further erode the fabric of our society, in my opinion. So I forgave the child. I advocated for him to be treated as a juvenile and instead of as an adult in Michigan, which they did. And he was subsequently released after 7 years. He had a blended sentence. He had done well enough in 7 years where they said he can go home and, you know, live his life. I mean, he hasn't run for office or anything, but he hasn't been in trouble anymore either. So, you know, he's been home since 2007, 2008 maybe, and I keep in touch with him to try to make sure that, you know, he's still living up to his obligations, because, you know, second chance, I believe in second chances, and we all should make the most of our second chances. So from there, that's kind of the fuel for the work that I do today. So my son's death won't be in vain. I want to make sure that we work on changing this so-called adversarial system. It doesn't need to be adversarial. And that's where Andy and I kind of come together to try to figure out how to make that happen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So sorry for that tremendous loss. Thank you both for sharing your personal stories. It's and just being vulnerable and open with us. And I do want to ask, you know, this isn't the first time you've sat together for this kind of courageous conversation in front of a group, but what's it like to sit with someone from the other side? And to have a relationship and to see yourselves as allies or potential allies in creating change. How has that been, and how has that evolved for you since you've known each other?
Andy?
Well, you know what? It's really been amazing, because when I first started out trying to get involved and trying to get into the conversation around reforming a system that was never designed for success for anyone, I wasn't sure if there was going to be room for corrections officers' voices in that or not. As far as I was concerned, the reformers had a blind spot. And the blind spot was that the second most largest impacted persons weren't in that conversation. We're the second largest impacted in the conversation around reform. And most of all of the reform I saw didn't really speak to officers. Their voices weren't in that conversation. Now, since then, I've learned a lot from Ronald as well. But Ronald was one of the first people that vouched for me. Really, you know, we'll get into this conversation, but you know, Ronald and I have to have a certain amount of, you know, I guess it's, you can call it street credibility if you want, but we have to have a certain amount of credibility to lead our prospective groups right into a conversation with folks that, of course, aren't going to see eye to eye on some things, but it's up to he and I to figure out where we do and how we have that conversation in a way that makes the most impact. And he was the first one that vouched for me. I was on another call with another group of reformers, and they said, Ronald Simpson-Bey said Andy Potter's a real one. Have a conversation with him. And it meant a lot to me. And since then we've met, and he's only gotten better at harassing me every time we meet. So it's only gotten better. So.
What about for you, Ronald?
Yeah, I mean, for me, yes.
Ability with Andy in Andy's world.
Like I said, historically, Andy and I, we've been taught to be on opposite ends of the fences, where our relationship should be antagonistic because he was a corrections officer and I was an incarcerated person. So traditionally, these have been sides that never saw eye to eye about anything except, they were in the same place at the same time for a certain period of time. And so when he and I came together for this conversation, we first met at the event he put on at John Jay around his One Voice Unified. Those of us in the field, Just Leadership, we believe we say everybody closer to the problem and closer to the solution. And we agreed that the corrections officer should have been at the table. But historically, they didn't want to be standoffish. The door is open to this conversation, but historically, it's been difficult because, like Andy said, we have that credibility with our constituent. So for Andy to tell his constituent, hey, we need to have a conversation with the people that's been in jail and prison around reform, and for me to say the same thing to my group, it's like, ooh, like that takes a lot of courage, because you can immediately lose all your credibility and then no one listens to you anymore. But we were fortunate enough that both of our sides were like, okay, these guys might be on to something, because our constituents recognized individually, each of us had credibility in our circles. We called a spade. We were always straight down the line from the beginning of our careers to the time that he and I met. So we had built that level of credibility. So when we met, it was like kindred spirits. We started talking over dinner that night after the event. We started talking about what our individual work was, and we decided, man, we can do this together, because at the end of the day, Andy and I both had the core moral concept that we wanted for the other person what we wanted for ourselves. And that's the key to this whole thing around how we get past it. You just have to ask yourself, what do I want for me, and why don't I want it for the other person? Ask yourself why, because subconsciously we say, well, we want it for the other person, but in the reality, you see what happens. It doesn't always play out. So Andy and I have been able to cross that threshold and actually push on that button and make it uncomfortable for our constituents, to make them look at that mirror. Why don't I want the same thing for these people that I want for myself and my family? So we operate from that foundation. It's been beautiful, at least for me ever since. I don't know about Andy, but.
So tell us a little bit about what you see as some of the successes of having had these conversations, of the work that you've done to bring both the voices of people who've been incarcerated and the voices of corrections officers to the table. Andy, you gave us the example of the issue around the food, that both corrections officers and people incarcerated were aligned in feeling that this was something that really needed to be changed for the well-being of everyone who was in the prison. What other issues have you been working on, or you've been thinking about? And I'm thinking particularly during the time of the pandemic, when I know that COVID affected prisons, both people incarcerated and corrections officers, at very, very high rates. Was there work that you did or thought about together during that period?
I can start on that one. It's for me, and I think for working with Andy, for me, it's been more about system change. I mean, we haven't focused on individual issues. We've had conversation around individual issues and possible collaboration areas. But for me, our work has been more systemic. So by that, I mean, we have taken the initiative to educate others. Andy and his group invited me to, is it BBC? I forgot what it was. They got a program that they implement with college students And so we go in and have the same conversation with classes, with 2 or 3 colleges at one time, and have a courageous conversation to inform their hearts and minds of how they should look at this as they go forward to help. So that's how we make system change, to change the hearts and minds of our community. So instead of working on one issue, which is only going to change the mind of a limited set of people, from my perspective, we have worked on larger educational impact and having people change their hearts and minds around how they view people that's been impacted by the system, how they view people that are jailers in the system, and where we can have these common grounds in these conversations.
Andy,
Yeah.
what do you?
Yeah, I would agree. We didn't work directly during the pandemic. But this is the thing to remember, I think, is that this is a system that's killing us. It's killing those who live there, and it's killing those who work there. COVID isn't done by a long shot in these prisons. And we've had a lot of loss of life. And it's a lot has to do with the conditions. And a lot has to do with the way those conditions came about. And I can tell you the one thing I would say through COVID, and I'm hoping, I think we will get into more conversation around the system itself and the system changes, because there's a lot of changes that need to take place that we can discuss. But COVID, there's a lot of stories that don't get told. There's a lot of stories, even out of Michigan, where corrections officers and those who are incarcerated work shoulder to shoulder trying to save lives. Every day they go in there. And that doesn't get talked about because America's fascinated with corrections and law enforcement for the wrong reasons. They want to see a shield. They want to see somebody getting dragged down the rock. They want to see the gas. Turn on any channel almost on your TV. You're going to see cop. You'll see all kinds of programs, right? And it depicts things and sets a narrative so deep in America's psyche, right? That what's a good corrections officer supposed to do? And what are you supposed to do when you first go into prison and defend yourself and get, there's a lot of stories that Ronald and I can tell you that don't make it on TV. I would just say that.
So let's kind of turn to the question of systems. And it sounds very much like you're both saying that a starting point or a critical point is the changing of the narrative, the changing of the hearts and minds. How have you seen that happening, and how are you seeing that change the system?
Well, I mean, I guess from my perspective, I'm thinking that, I mean, from a number of ways is, as Andy pointed out earlier, the event that he gave back in 2017 was around a group of funders. And the fact that this particular work that we're trying to do is being funded by, funders, and they take active, interest in that tells you something right there. It's not just a sexy thing at the moment. They're trying to invest money because they believe that this change is necessary, number one, and possible, number two, because they think it was possible, even though it might be necessary, they wouldn't give their money to it. So for me, that's a one bellwether. That's an indicator that is having some impact in our communities. And as far as the work together, like I said, Andy and I, we've had the opportunity to engage both of our constituents in different areas around the country to have opportunities to collaborate with each other around different issues, different events in those communities. We have been invited to some tables. Well, Andy and I have put together a proposal. Our organization put together a proposal, and we collaborate on, how would it make it stronger for the corrections officers to be able to support it, and vice versa. They had things they work on, and we would collaborate behind the scenes to put together our individual proposals to take to our constituents and to our community so we can sell it. And to me, it's been successful because the pointers that he gave after he read our proposal were really helpful for us to be able to go back and critique it and make it relevant to be able to be more effective and to the people that we were trying to reach. And I'm thinking that we did the same for him and his group.
Yep, I totally agree. And, even when it comes to the language we use and the labels and different things like that, right? So we come up in a system. Ronald and I were raised in this system, and nobody knows it better than us, right? So who better to be on the forefront of being able to say, I can speak for myself, and I know Ronald can too, where he and I were 30 years ago is not where we are today. And, I had a hand in this system, and that's mine to carry with me. But to see the pendulum swing and reform back and forth over 30 years, I can tell you, I've seen that pendulum come and go. And this is the first time that I've seen that pendulum stay in one spot for any length of time. It's always a sense of urgency because I'm always worried that that pendulum is going to swing back. Same with law enforcement. Right now, there's this opportunity, but if we don't work together and bring our voices together and really tell the truth about this system and really pull back the layers and say, it's killing us and this is why, and this is what it really is, then we won't see change. But I believe there's been major change. I believe there has been different, I wouldn't have been able to bring a group of leaders from all over the United States, of union leaders, some of the most powerful in the United States in corrections, together and have a conversation about reform if it wasn't changing their landscape too, if things weren't changing enough, right? So
I'm gonna ask you, Andy, to tell us the truth, pull back that curtain for us a little bit, and press you a little on some more specifics. Look, tell us what is behind the curtain, and what are some of the reforms that you want to see, that you think need to be made in the system for there a change in our total system, not just in people's hearts and minds. Not that that's important, but when we're talking also about how do we actually want to change the number of people who are incarcerated, the conditions in the prisons, et cetera. So paint that picture of the system for us a little bit, and then tell us what you, for both of you, but we'll start with Andy, what you see as some of the most important reforms that you would want to see advanced now.
One of the things that we work the hardest on right now, I think, is wellness, health and wellness. And I think that goes hand in hand. I think anyone who has come into contact with the system and corrections or law enforcement in some fashion carries a level of trauma. You cannot expect corrections officers to come in and day out, see, hear, and do the kinds of things that they're called upon to do by the system. You got to remember, when somebody is taken to segregation, when somebody is restrained, when any of that happens, that's not just corrections officers doing it. That's policy, procedure, that's inside of a system that has trained them, conditioned them, desensitized them. So when you come in and day out, you're asked to do things where you eventually start to dehumanize somebody that's in front of you. I'll say this because it's part of my journey, and not all corrections officers have went down my path. But I'll place this in your mind because it made a huge impact in mine. Imagine bringing somebody in, strip searching them, taking their name and giving them a number and making them use that number day in and day out. Now, there's something to that also steals your dignity too, and also steals your humanity too. And that's truth. And that's not looked at. And that's not talked about. But that changed my life. I can tell you that there's events and places that I've went to that that's familiar. And so, you know, when you think about how you want to change the system, you have to first start with dignity and first start with reinstilling the humanity for everybody. You know, and we brought an exchange to BJ, and we brought folks from BJ to Michigan to stay with corrections officers. We did this exchange and it was an amazing thing. And, you know, I said the one thing that it did for me as a leader is it allowed me to see my members have a little bit of vulnerability. And because we're trained day in and day out not to be vulnerable with each other, not to allow that, to build that wall. And Ronald will tell you the same way. For him or others to survive in that place, they have to build a wall as well. And it's traumatizing. And the conditions and the things you go through. Think about this. These are the things in common: overcrowding, understaffing, no air conditioning. It's 115 degrees. Ronald, you and I both were in units that were 115 degrees during the summer, not one bit of air conditioning. They just installed ceiling fans when I was leaving, and you were probably leaving at the same time. It was full of asbestos. 4 of my partners are gone from cancer. Those are conditions, not just the food, but what I've just said. If we just focused on the conditions, we'd get somewhere. I'll stop talking because I think I've talked too much. But
well, we haven't talked too much, Andy, and I really want to thank you for bringing those examples and pulling back that curtain. Can't imagine those are easy memories to return to. So appreciate your offering that to us to help us understand. I'd love to hear from you, Ronald, if there's anything you want to add, and then I want to go back to this question of the conditions and the dehumanization.
Yeah. I mean, the depravity and dehumanization is like, I mean, we can sit here till tomorrow and tell you stories about the things we've seen and experienced on the inside. But I kind of want to bring it more like to the presence around this COVID-19 situation. Let's think about COVID in jails and prisons. Can you imagine being locked in a prison, in a cell, have no control over your social distancing, no PPP equipment, very little sanitation, and officers? I mean, you know, the prison's been on lockdown since March of last year, so there's been no visit. But the COVID that's coming into the prison is coming in through the staff. Now, what do you think that does to the morality of the people that's inside? And then you have officers saying, well, we refuse to get vaccination for whatever reason. I mean, you know, you can be personal or religious or just to say, well, I just don't want to do it because that's fine. But you have to think about the people that have no way to protect themselves. You know, my organization is working on, we got a national campaign called Just Us. And back when COVID hit last year, when everybody was trying to file motions and commutations, trying to get people released, our research revealed that there was not a single emergency management plan in place at any jail or prison in the United States. Not a single one. And let's think about this. Go back to Hurricane Katrina, 2006. They had an evacuation plan for cats and dogs at the Humane Society in Louisiana, but none for the people that were in New Orleans jail. Those that some of them had to stay in the jail while you know the sewage was rising up through the floors because there was no place for it to go. They were locked in a cell. The water was rising. One of the jails, they took the people out and herded them on to an overpass while the storm was blowing. So this made us think, well, we have to have an emergency management plan in place to protect people going forward. In September of last year, Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, she helped co-write a bill with us to introduce the Correctional Act. I forgot the exact name of it, but it's dealing with the emergency correction. That's what it is, the Emergency Management Plan for Corrections Facilities. And what it does, it puts in place automatic stopgaps. So when these things happen, fires, pandemics, or hurricanes, whatever we have, that people can be safely evacuated in a humanely manner instead of leaving them there to suffer. So this whole thing around COVID right now is just, prisons are super spreader places, make no mistake about it. So it's in the public's best interest to provide protection to the people that's in prison, because those that's coming home, if we haven't protected, they're gonna bring COVID right with them. And we have a new variant after the Delta variant. So let's be mindful of this as we go forward.
Thank you. Thanks, Ronald. I do want to come back to this frame that you brought up, Andy, of the dehumanization. And that was something that struck me, and I think struck those of us from BJ when we came to Michigan and had the opportunity to visit a prison and to speak with the corrections officers, that the system is completely dehumanizing. And so the question is, how did we get here? Why do we have such a dehumanizing system? Why do we have such high rates of incarceration? Is the answer to overcrowding and understaffing really to add more staff so we can have more people incarcerated? Or what is your perspective on the underlying issues in this system? And Andy, maybe I'll ask you to, if you can, bring in a little bit of information from the Norway system, which I know you've spent some time visiting, and maybe that can shed some light on these questions for the United States, or give us something to look toward.
Yeah, so in America, I believe that the origins of prison was based on systematic racism, structural racism. And if you go back and if you look at the way the prison system has evolved, it's really because of the way our society in America is, and the way we treat each other, and the way we look at and view humanity. It's much different than Scandinavian countries, where they view each other with a much higher level of dignity and a much higher level of respect and humanization. The difference is this: when we incarcerate to punish. That's the mindset in America. Don't just put them in prison. Don't just take their freedom. We want to punish them the whole time, right? Everybody just, that is what's expected. That's what's placed upon you when you come into it. And in Scandinavian countries such as Norway, it's much different. They view the loss of freedom as the punishment. That's the best, the shortest answer I can give you, the best answer I can give you. And we can talk a little bit more about the Norway system. There's things in Norway, I believe, that work very well, that I truly believe could work very well here. And there's things that they do in Norway that I don't believe we could bring here. There just isn't.
Because of the racism, because of that structural racism, or something else?
No, because of the way the system is designed. There's the way our system is designed right now. If I was to be at a cell door more than 5 minutes, talking with somebody, trying to coach, trying to mentor, whatever the case may be, it's going to be viewed by my coworkers, by the administration and others as over-familiarization. And when they see that, now you can be fired. So that's another thing that's placed in people's minds. Most people that take this job, and I interview a lot of new employees, the first thing I ask them is, why are you taking the job? Why are you doing it? And the overwhelming majority will say, it's for the money. It's to get me, like for myself, it brought me into the middle class. It was my pathway. And for a lot of others, it's that pathway. But they always say, and if I can help somebody, I really want to help somebody. And the light in their eyes goes out between the time I see them when they first take the job and the time they go through the academy and they walk through those front gates. They realize this is not set up so that they can just help somebody. So there's a lot of things that come into, there's a lot of nuances to this. Ronald and I will tell you a lot of things, and it's only going to scratch the surface, really. So.
Thank you, Andy. Ronald, do you want to add anything to that, particularly around the question of, or the issue of racism in the system?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, let us take a hard reflect. I mean, it shouldn't be a hard reflect, but let us look back at America's history. The correction system was built on America's original sin. We have never gotten over or apologized for slavery. Once slave was abolished, then they created the Jim Crow laws and this whole system of slave catching, and correction grew out of the slave catching and what have you. So we have never, ever gotten past that yet in our country. And that's part of the problem. And that's part of what we seeking to, kind of change, because until you get rid of that underpinning, it's going to always be there. I mean, you can look to the South for a real close example of what it was in antebellum time. Look at the prisons in Mississippi and Louisiana, Angola, Parchment, those places down there. They still have cotton fields where guys have to go out and pick cotton. We're talking 2021. They still got people that's in prison picking cotton because of the clause in the 13th Amendment that say in cases of involuntary servitude, slavery is allowed. So they have people still doing slave labor in some of those southern prisons because we haven't gotten past that clause in the 13th Amendment. So that is the premise on which this whole system is built. Now you have people like Andy that they know that and they're trying to change that. And you have some people want to keep the status quo. So it's just going to continue until we change enough hearts and minds where the status quo starts to lean. Dr. Martin Luther King said it best. It says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And so Andy and I are busy trying to bend this arc toward justice that we have to fight so hard because, until somebody got to step up and do it. And like you said, the pendulum is in a place now where more and more people are saying, oh. So I always say I work to put the humanity back in being human. So we see humanity kind of creeping in here now because we've seen the ravages of COVID. When people get locked in and on themselves, they have to really reflect because they have so many external things that keep them distracted. So when you didn't reflect for a year and a half, oh man, this is pretty bad being locked up like this. But what about people that's in jail and prison? So this whole notion of why we are, we all know where we are. We don't all want to admit it, but we know how we got here and why we're here. So now for us to have these courageous conversations and have the courage to make the change.
Thank you, Ronald. So I want to ask you, Andy, as a white man who oversees a union that is largely majority white, what's it like to talk about race and racism with your officers? Is that something that you do, that you try to do, and how does it go?
I'm going to pass it over to Ronald. He can go first on it. I'll answer the best I can. And I want to, if I could, just lean in on another point that Ronald brought up. And he and I, we may spar a little bit over this, but because I want to shed some light on this. He brought up the fact that corrections officers bring COVID into the prisons and they don't want to be vaccinated. A large majority don't want to be vaccinated. And that's true. But what I want folks to keep in mind is that there's a large number of folks incarcerated as well that don't want to be vaccinated. Right. And I'll tell you my opinion on why that is. This is just my opinion. And it has a lot to do with trust. Now you got a system that from day one wasn't led right by our country, by the leaders of our country. It was back and forth. There's been tons of social media around distrust and don't get vaccinated because of this, that, and the other thing. That's a whole nother conversation you should have sometime, Julie, is the rabbit holes that are out there in social media nowadays. But but the distrust for the system even, right? To come to you now and say, we've got this vaccine, you should trust us, you should take this vaccine, for either those who are incarcerated or those who work there. Now they're just supposed to, when a system hasn't done anything to prove itself to want to look after your best interest or your health, now all of a sudden they've got an answer. And that's not as easy. That's as complex in some ways, because it's so polarized, and America is so polarized. That's as complex as having a conversation about race in the prison system. There is a lot of tension in law enforcement and communities right now. And to bring that conversation inside of a prison system where it's already tense on a day-to-day basis is very challenging. That does not mean that as a leader, I shouldn't be stepping into that conversation and taking a risk with the position that I hold. If I'm unwilling to take a risk to tell the truth, if I'm unwilling to take a risk and try to have this conversation, then I shouldn't be in a place of leadership at all. So it's very important that we do it. How we do it is really about meeting people where they're at first, and then trying to bring that conversation in a way that they understand that I'm not calling all of them racist because I say that the structure is built on racism. In a lot of ways, it's perpetuated because we're exploited. And they have to understand that. They have to understand that they're in that system. The system is built on racism. But they can't change policy on their own. They can't change. There's a lot of things that their hands are tied to, and they can't change. But we're inextricably linked in so many ways that helps the conversation to take place. But it's very difficult, and I'm awkward around it. I'm ignorant to so much when it comes to how you have a conversation about race. You pointed it out. People probably didn't realize this. I'm a middle-aged white guy. And for me, just to have a conversation about race is difficult for me. I'm awkward and ignorant about so many things. So it's hard. I'll just tell you, it's very hard.
You muted, Shirley.
There we go. I appreciate your full honesty there, Andy. And Ronald, I would guess, is this something that you have talked about together? Where do you see the entry points, Ronald, for the conversations that need to happen around race with people who, haven't, like Andy, maybe are feeling awkward or not knowledgeable or not even thinking about this? And certainly in the case of corrections officers in Michigan, whose primary experience of people of color is in the prison system with folks who are incarcerated. Where do you see the possibility for those conversations to happen, that changing to happen?
Well, I mean, first, I like to piggyback off of something Andy talked about, the distrust about taking the vaccine, and it's definitely a lot of distrust on the people that's in prison, and rightfully so. Let us not forget the history of Black people in America and vaccinations. The Tuskegee experiment, the eugenics programs from the 60s, and all these things were even more modern. Andy can remember in Jackson, there were two units in Jackson, Park Davis, and they were two pharmaceutical units in Jackson, and they used to come in and run experiments on the people that's incarcerated through those two buildings. Because Park Davis was a pharmaceutical company that the state has ceded this building to. They could come in and practice their medicine or injections or whatever, and they would pay the incarcerated people, amount of money to be experimented on, but it was still experimentation. So the distrust in prisons is real high. So yeah, I get that. And that's something that we're fighting real hard to overcome. But you asked about the entry point around these conversations and how we get there. And I think I started this conversation by saying, okay, what do I want for myself? And why don't I want it for this person? Why would I want something for myself and not want it for Andy just because he's a corrections officer? So we've been taught these stereotype things about each other that keeps us in these separate corners, that keep us in silos, that keep us separated. We have more in common than we have, in different, but we just take these small differences, and most of them based on, suspicion. Humans are naturally suspicious of each other. So if you're not in my tribe, I'm suspicious of you, whether it's black, white, I don't care what it is. So what happens is if we don't get beyond those barriers that bear suspicion and ask that hard question, I want this for me, but why don't I want this for him? Why am I angry at him? Why are we angry at each other? I think we just been taught to be angry at each other. It's like, there's no need for it. So if you can make people just have that moment, that aha moment, and think about it for a minute, just think, why do you not want this for this person? I mean, some people just, I call it's a scale from 1 to 5. Your 1s are preaching to the choir, your 5s are people you're gonna never get. So you have to judge people on that spectrum and figure out, well, let me try to get some of these 4s to 3 and some of these 2s to 3. And if we can start moving them toward the center, the 1s and the 5s, they'll be either nullified or they have to come in themselves. So my entry point is, let's have this tough conversation with ourselves why we don't want the same thing for our fellow man.
Thank you, Ronald. I want to bring in a question that came up in the chat that I think also speaks to this this issue of racism in the system and people's perceptions, and how we might need to start with ourselves. And this is around the pushback to reform. We had a panel a couple years ago, almost 2 years ago now at BJ, about bail reform, because New York State changed some of its laws to allow for greater reforms as an effort, a step toward decarceration. And there was a lot of fear around that crime is going to go up, and if we decarcerate, that means our cities are not going to be safe, our streets are not going to be safe. So one is, how do you respond to an argument like that? Where do you see race playing into that kind of pushback against reform? And what are some ways that you're seeing reformers effectively handle that?
That's a good question, and it's a tough one, because it's not just based on race, it's based on race and fear. Let us not forget fear. Fear is the overriding factor of anything. If somebody is afraid, I don't care what race you are. If you scare a person, they'll do they do irrational stuff to feel unafraid anymore. So the thing with bail reform, any type of reform, you always have these situations where the systems that we're trying to reform will, create situations to try to fear the community, to scare the community. I'm gonna go back to Michigan around when they were trying to let people go. Andy can probably remember the incident in Muskegon. There was an incident in Muskegon where a guy molested a child that came to the visiting room. But the thing was, the administration had been warned ahead of time by the guy's monkey, hey, this guy's gonna molest this child in the visiting room. They knew about it, and they videotaped it. And after it happened, then now this is why we shouldn't have business in prisons. They videotaped it because they knew it was gonna happen. It's not like it was a surprise. And the same thing back in '92, there was a guy, the guy let out of prison. I'm not gonna mention his name, but he got out and killed 2 girls and changed the whole parole system. And before they let him out, he told the psych, he said, I'm not ready to go because I still got mental issues. They let him out, he killed 2 girls in the community, and they changed the whole parole board systems. So anytime you had this type of reform, all they gotta take 1 or 2 incidents and it scares everybody. Let us not forget, what's the guy that Dukakis let out back in the 80s? And Bush killed him for it. I mean, Willie Brown. Yeah, let's not forget Willie Brown and all these types of situations. So anytime you have reform, you're going to have a situation where there's an incident. The incident called a huge amount of fear. And it's going to roll back to reform. The reforms we took 10, 15, 20, 30 years to get, one incident will roll them back because of the fear. So what we have to do, we have to get beyond letting those one-off incidents scare the hell out of us, where we just get rid of, throw the baby out with the bathwater. How we do that? Yeah, that's yet to be seen, but that's what we got to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Ronald. I want to turn the conversation a little bit towards the related topic around policing. And Andy, I know that you were doing some thinking, particularly after the calls to defund the police to abolish the police. That's been a movement for a while, but certainly that call got much louder after the murder of George Floyd last year. And tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the police. How does policing in the United States relate to the criminal justice system? And when there's where do you see the possibility for change, or does the whole thing need to be abolished and start over?
So I think my position initially, and is still, that we should not box ourselves in talking about defunding the police. I personally know through all of my experience in corrections what defunding corrections has done. And I can tell you it has ravaged the system. And now we're just scraping to have enough money for training, the right proper kind of training and programming and things like that. Reform is expensive. That's the problem with this, right? That's the whole problem with it. You have bipartisan support when it's easy, when people can just check a box because they close a prison. Not to mention they double bunk 4 other prisons so they can close one and check the box to say we've closed a prison, now we're reformers. And that's not real, and that's not sustainable, and that's not in the same way with law enforcement. I'm against the notion of defunding law enforcement. I'm not against, and I do support defunding the militarization of police. I don't think police should be militarized and go into communities of color and take advantage of the moment. I think too many people of color die by the hands of police. But I also think that in order to wrap our arms around this now, and learn the lessons from corrections reform, where corrections officers were left out of the conversation. And I, again, take some responsibility as a leader for not injecting them into that. But we're 10 years behind. We're 10 years behind that conversation. And if we could have been a stakeholder in that conversation 10 years ago, think about how powerful that would be now and how much learning could have been done between then and now. Policing and reform in policing, there's opportunity right now. But what I don't like is politicians, policymakers, and others in communities rushing to the notion that they should just defund, when I can just tell you, anytime I see a system defunded, all of the resources that they collect do not go where they should go to begin with. And if we defunded America's police today, we still would not have the kind of resources we need to put into those communities to lift those communities up. It has to be both. You have to reform. You have got to reform the police and expect more and rebuild and reimagine what that relationship of trust and protect and serve means to the community. And you have to put resources into those communities so a young Black man doesn't come into contact with those police under those same circumstances. It can't be one or the other. That's what got us here, right? That's what got us here, is one or the other. And we can't do that, keep going, moving forward.
Thank you, Andy. And I want to hear your perspective, Ronald, and also add in another question is, why is it so hard to break out of that binary, that it's one or the other, right? That partisanship that has, or polarization, why from your perspective?
It's conditioning. I mean, it's conditioning premised on, the history of our country. We've just been conditioned to think like that. And it's the automatic fallback. It's our automatic retreat position. No matter what's going on, that's a safe retreat because we know we have a whole system behind us to support those positions. And for me, I'm not an abolitionist by any stretch of the imagination, unlike many of my colleagues and reformers, because I've been in prison for 27 years, even though it was wrongful. And trust me, we need prison. It's just how we use them. That's the problem. We over prison. We over police. We make up what? I say what, 4 or 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. That's insane. In Michigan, we have like 4,000 or 5,000 felonies on the book. I can't even think of 100. So I don't know how to come up with 5,000 felonies, but there are 45,000 collateral consequences to those 5,000 felonies. So now how are you gonna overcome that? You get out. You up against a brick wall when you get out. So my thing is that we need to. Not that we don't need prison, not that we don't need correction reform, not that we don't need to reform the police and law enforcement. It's just how we do it. It's just how we do it. It's not that it's not necessary, not that any of them are not necessary. It's just a matter of doing it in smart and intelligent ways and not the same way we've been doing it. What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. So we should recognize that after 400 years of slavery and incarceration, if we keep doing it the same way, we're gonna have the same results. So let us be more mindful. Let us be thought. Let's have the courage to stand up for and have a spine and say, look, this is wrong. We can do this better. We don't have to be so punitive about this. Like Andy said earlier, going to prison is the punishment. I can tell you from experience. So, but all the other stuff they add on top of that once you get there, that's ridiculous. That's unnecessary. It's inhumane. I don't even think we treat war criminals that bad. And it's crazy once you get inside these facilities. So it's a matter of treating humans, like you want to be treated. They can be incarcerated, but treat them humanely, give them the skills to get out and be successful to make our society safer.
So Ronald, I had the opportunity to hear you in a similar conversation to this last winter. And I remember you saying at that time that you were not an abolitionist. And I also remember you saying, it was very striking to me, sort of wondering how you hold both of these things, that hurt people hurt people. That was the phrase that you used, right? That people who have had hurt in their lives, who have been hurt and don't know how to deal with that, then go on to hurt people, and then in our system end up in prison. So I'm curious to hear if you could, kind of start from scratch, like what would be the investment or the work that would be done to just fundamentally transform our society so that there are fewer people who are hurt, who then hurt people, right? And is that part of the conversation for you when there's a discussion about funding and where resources should be deployed?
Absolutely. Trauma-informed therapy, trauma-informed leadership. We have to address the trauma. People that hurt people that have committed these crimes and go to prison, no one ever takes into consideration what they went through before they committed a crime. It is not even allowed in the court argument. It's not allowed in consideration. That sentencing is not allowed at all. They could have been raped, beaten, had a horrible childhood, been fed dog food or whatever, and they get to prison. But no one takes that in consideration ahead of time. So we need to, as a society, look at how our people, our children are being raised, how our children are living. Not all of them are being abused, but those that hurt people, they are living abusive lives. And so if we are not going to change how the very infrastructure would impact their lives, let's at least provide some stopgap measures. Let's provide some therapy along the way. It should be embedded into the school system, because it's just as natural as breathing air. They are traumatized, and they learn trauma, and they learn to bully and trauma each other along the way. Then they become adults. Then you have Columbine shootings, you have Sandy Hook, you have all these crazy things because that trauma was never addressed, and they went down that rabbit hole of I'm angry and I'm self-pitying. So we have to provide some level of support for our young people and the people that start getting in trouble at early ages. Let's have some interventions instead of just beating the hell out of them and want to punish them to death. Let's have some intervention where we provide them some humane services and allow them to feel loved and accepted.
Andy, what about you? What do you see as an investment that could be made? I know you said that when defunding happens, the resources don't go dollar for dollar from the criminal justice system to those kinds of preventative education, those kinds of programs or interventions. But what do you see as a possibility? Ronald told us, getting psychological services in school, that should be part of every school system. Where's an investment that you think we could make as a society, either on a national level or state by state, that would make a real difference?
I can tell you from some experience that in the correctional system, a very large number are mentally ill, and there's not enough education around identifying that or training to help deal with that on a trauma level basis. And I think if we were to invest in that, like when law enforcement's called somewhere, why are they not taking somebody who is adverse in that kind of trauma, who understands that kind of trauma, and who can help cope with that on the spot? I think there could be an investment there. I'm in the middle of working with some law enforcement, and it's very difficult when I'm up against somebody that's a policymaker or otherwise, just driving towards defunding the police because it's a quick way to get reelected, and it's a great soundbite. But they have no solutions, no ideas, and they're scared to death that somebody is going to do something that flies in the face of their reform. And some of this isn't as complicated as we make it. Like that, the mentally ill. Just dealing with that correctly, properly, in a way that de-escalates, and to train harder on that. And by the way, you hear me say training. I want to be really clear. That's another one that people like to check a box on and say, well, we got reformed because we're going to retrain everybody. And that is just, you all know that's not transparent enough. Come on, let's get into really what that means. I'm talking state-of-the-art, 21st century training based on the situation we're dealing with as a community and as a society and as a country. Now, they incarcerate way too many, no doubt about that. We won't break cultures until we start to change hearts and minds. And we won't change hearts and minds until we start talking and investing in those kinds of solutions on the ground where it matters. Let me roll my sleeves up, right? But don't be running right in there to check a box because you want to be elected or you want to have a policy that somebody else can say, yep, I support you because you said this. It gets in the way. It's stumbling blocks for people like Ronald and myself who are on the ground in the trenches trying to sort this out. It's hard enough.
We're moving toward closing, and I want to ask you to leave us on a hopeful note. Can you share with us something that has recently that inspires you or has been inspiring you to continue to do this work? The work you're describing is so deep. It's not one piece of legislation. It's not getting one particular person elected. It's not one campaign slogan. It's cultural, right? It's really what you're describing is that changing of hearts and minds, that a change that is at the essence of what this country is to such a large extent. So where do you draw inspiration from as you move forward in doing this very hard work?
Me or Andy?
Ronald, go ahead.
I draw inspiration from it when I look at we talk about, in America, we talk a lot about the protests that's going around, the George Floyd killing and all these other things. But when I look out among the protesters, Those are not just all Black people. Look at the people who's actually protested. We are actually joining hands around a tough issue that nobody wants to address. But, you know, people that don't have any, you know, they're not, let me just put white people that have privilege don't have anything to gain by standing on these front lines with these people, with the Black protesters around the treatment that they receive, but they out there in the thousands. We remember the elderly man that was pushed down in DC a year or so ago and banged his head, 74-year-old white guy, mind his business. They rushed him and pushed him down because they hated that he was there. He was no threat to them. So I'm encouraged by seeing people have the courage to stand up and speak for somebody that don't have the same power to speak for themselves. As somebody that's on the side of the coin that don't have as much power as somebody else to speak for myself, I can really appreciate that. And it gets lost on the media. You don't see them talking much about that perspective of the story. But for those of us that do this work, when we see them link arm with us in unity, true unity that they don't have to do, to me, that says it all. Those are the images that we should be highlighting on television. These are the images that our community should be seeing because it'll promote more if you see it. They just downplay it because it's not salacious. It doesn't feed into the narrative that, oh, you know, we should be separate in America and this racial nonsense. So for me, just to see that, I mean, it gives my heart, I mean, it keeps me encouraged in doing the work that I do because I know that a change is going to come.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronald. Andy.
There's a few things that give me courage and give me strength and hope. I would say that the common sense conversations that I see unfolding across the United States, people willing to have a conversation that makes sense, and when it's so polarized, and they're brave enough to do that. My daughter, we live in a community that's very conservative. I study and work hard against militia, military militia and white supremacy. And she wrote a paper against white nationalism. And she laid it out. And she lost a lot of friends and got into a altercation even. But she was determined to write that paper because she believed it was the right thing to do. Just a young girl in Podunk, Lake Odessa, surrounded, right? And she did it. And if my daughter can do that and stand on her own 2 feet in the face of that, then I guess I can learn something from that. And as awkward as it is, and I said it, and as ignorant as I am to a lot of this, I'm still willing to have the conversation, and I'm still willing to take the risk, and so was Ronald. And I'm glad all of you showed up because it shows me and gives me hope and faith that people still want to have a common sense conversation about the things we face in our country. So that's where I will leave it.
Thank you, Anne. Your daughter has a very good role model. And I just want to say I have a lot of chats here, just kind of applause and yes, and exactly. And these guys are amazing. So you're getting a lot of thumbs up from this crowd and a lot of appreciation. And I want to just, oh, Ronald, you're muted. Did you want to say something?
No, my mother was calling. I was telling her I'd call her back.
You didn't invite her to come watch this?
My mother, she won't get on computers and stuff, so it's hard to get her to do it. I have to show her the video when I go to her house.
Great. Well, she's got something to be proud of too, and we are so grateful again for the honesty, the vulnerability, the courage that it takes for the two of you to come and be in conversation together and speak to our community and speak so openly about your vision for what this country needs and what might be possible. So with enormous gratitude, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Felicia Saul to close us out this evening. And
I just want to thank Shuli, Rabbi Shuli Passow, our Director of Community Engagement, for having this panel come together in such profound ways. And of course, to Andy Potter, a longtime friend and of BJ, and now we have a new friend with Ronald Simpson-Bey. Thank you. We look forward to many conversations, and I just want to honor a couple of things and then share a couple of things moving forward. One, I think, you know, in the Jewish calendar, as Shuli said when she opened, we're given a year to pause and reflect, and that's a time-bound orientation, which is very Jewish. You know, that time gives us a way to reorient, but I want to say also people do, and you know, every 7 years is one version of how we think about change, but day in and day out, there are Shemitah people. There are people who raise up a different story and who show a different way and are willing to cross, to take down fences, which is part of Shemitah too, to say, I'm going to actually have conversations and be proximate, not only to the people who I'm naturally proximate to, but to others. And we have the blessing this evening of having Shemitah people with us, Andy Potter and Ronald Simpson-Bey, who day in and day out are creating a revisioning of the system, of our system of mass incarceration, and trying to change hearts and minds. And so I just want to acknowledge that this is not a one moment conversation, and I think for us to also for those of us who, some of us who have had the opportunity, or I don't know that it's an opportunity at all times, to spend some time visiting folks in prison or being proximate to the prison system, which I certainly have had my time to do that, but we need to know more. Prisons are put far away. They're put in at a distance so that we actually don't see them. They're put in places where it's hard to get to, where people aren't visible. And most of the stuff we see, as Ron and Andy have said, are you know, just the you know, caricatures of what's happening. And so it's on us as a community to really understand what's actually happening, whether it's at Rikers Island or at Bedford Hills Prison or what's happening in Michigan, and to do the work to understand what's happening, and to be proximate both to folks who have been incarcerated or are incarcerated, as well as those who are guarding our prisons and working in our prisons, and to help be a part of being the bridge builders. And so this is part of what we're trying to do this year, and we'll continue to do. In December, we're planning to have 2 conversations, one about policing in New York City, safety and security in our city. We're hoping Alvin Bragg, who's going to be the new Manhattan DA, will be joining us, as well as a conversation in the Jewish community about safety, security, and policing, which has a whole nother layer to it, given the Jewish community's fear, and rightly so, of being on, you know, being targeted in many ways, and how complicated a conversation that's not only complicated in the Jewish community at large, but at BJ in specific. So we're not shying away from these questions, we're leaning into them. And we want to invite the generosity and courage that Andy and Ronald have shown this evening, to help us as a collective move forward into the conversation rather than away from it, and to not oversimplify in order that we aren't willing to actually do the work to be in conversation in a way that might actually move things forward in a more revisioned way. And finally, I want to also mention some work that's actually been going on for over a year now. We've had first it was the Race and Us committee from 2 years ago, and then the diversity morphed into the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, of which a small group of folks, which were led by Martha Ecclesworth, Judith Glasgow, and Deborah Kalmus, have been working on education and have worked really, really hard to construct 3 modules, one around mass incarceration, one around education, and one around healthcare, around what's happening around the pandemic and the intersection with the racism in our country, around those specific issues. And so we're going to be launching very shortly. The dates are just being finalized now, an opportunity for people to take these modules. They're in there are 2 sessions at a time for each module. And our goal is to get 150 members of BJ to take at least one of the modules. Again, there are only 2 sessions each, as part of our continued work to understand and really discuss and internalize the ways of what's happening in our world, in our city, and in these systems that are often hard to kind of tell the truth about. So I want to say first a huge thank you to Martha, Judith, and Deborah for their ongoing efforts to build this work, which has not been insignificant. And I want to encourage and really invite everyone who's on this call this evening, as well as your friends. People who are more inclined tend to sign up. People who are less inclined need to be asked. And so we want all of us who are on this call to be shlichim, to be ambassadors, to keep getting people in the conversation. And so you'll be seeing shortly more information about that, and the signups will begin, and 15 BJ members have been trained in order to facilitate the modules. So finally, I want to close with just my own sense of a prayer that or just an acknowledgement, really, that we are fed by your inspiration, Andy, Ronald. It's so important, and I think all of us in our lives have met people that continue to teach us that we should not despair and that we should stay the course of dreaming. It doesn't mean that it's a simple course. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have incredibly challenging obstacles or systems that have been entrenched for 400 years. But if there are not going to be people who stay with hope and inspiration and day-to-day dedication, we'll never get there. And so we want to once again thank Andy and Ronald and Shuli for this evening. And on this Shemitah year, to be able to pause to meet those folks, and then to reinvigorate ourselves to say, we will not desist. This is part of what we are as a community, as a religious community, to say, we have to imagine that society can change. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. And we look forward to more and more conversations to be inspired over and over again. Have a wonderful night.